Welcome to the Shipping Podcast, where you meet interesting maritime professionals sharing their passion for the shipping industry and their everyday job. I am your host. My name is Lena Gothberg.
Find the gap between the train and the platform.
Welcome to the 31st episode of the Shipping Podcast, and the second one made in London. When I knew that I was going to London for some interviews, I posted that on social media and I asked for people to tell which guests they wanted to listen to. And one of the people who answered me was Hannes Jonsson, a PhD student at that time, who has written a thesis for the degree of Doctor in Engineering, which he calls In Search of Maritime Energy Management. Hannes told me that you need to see Tristan Smith when you come to London. You can't visit London without seeing Tristan. So I contacted Tristan and I asked him if he wanted to become a guest of the Shipping Podcast, and he immediately accepted. Dr. Tristan Smith is a lecturer in energy and transport at the UCL Energy Institute, where he leads a shipping modeling and analysis research group. Tristan has a degree in Engineering and Naval Architecture. Since January 2010, Tristan has been the coordinator of the project Low Carbon Shipping, a systems approach, leading 2 of the 6 work packages on modeling the global shipping system and regulation policy and incentives for low carbon shipping. One of the 3 principal fields of research that interests Tristan is low carbon shipping. His interest covers all aspects of shipping economics, logistics and operation. So the development and implementation of technologies and operational practices for the reduction of CO2 emissions from shipping, that is what he do in his everyday job. As a matter of interest, Tristan has also been involved in leading a consortium of 10 organizations to produce the 3rd IMO greenhouse gas study in 2014, a major publication for the industry, which is used as a reference for CO2 emissions regulatory discussions. I didn't know what to expect when I was going to see Tristan. It was at the end of the day, you can even hear the Big Ben, how late it was in the afternoon. But with all the energy that Tristan has, I think we achieved a really good conversation on matters that actually interest both the industry and the regulators at this moment in time. It was on February the 3rd that I met Tristan. I hope you will enjoy our conversation. This is Tristan Smith for you.
My name is Tristan Smith. I'm a naval architect by background, and I used to work in the Ministry of Defence, designing and looking at warships and submarines. And I currently run a small research group of maybe 15 people that study the shipping industry and its greenhouse gas emissions, so merchant shipping. And we look at it from the perspective of both the engineering, but also the economics, the questions about trade, interactions with transport cost, policy, and involve ourselves in as many of those discussions as we can.
And we are at the UCL Energy Institute. What is that?
And I should explain the place where I work as well. So I'm an academic, I'm a reader here in the University College London Energy Institute. And that's a group of about 200 people, staff and postdoctoral researchers and PhD students, which was set up about 6 years ago now with the objective of trying to step outside of the disciplinary boxes of academia. So if you imagine conventional economics departments and history departments and engineering departments, we wanted to set something up that didn't try and silo problems and was able to deal with the messy, real-world, complicated, interconnected industries and policies that will be needed on the subject of energy. And that's exactly what this place is. It's a chance for people to sit together who have very contrasting expertise, but work collectively on complicated, messy problems.
About energy.
About energy. And the subset of that we worry about is energy used by the shipping industry. But many of my colleagues are thinking about energy in the built environment, or energy in other modes of transport, or energy systems and power generation. So it's fantastic to be able to have lots of different people that we can ask questions on when we need to understand how do you produce hydrogen, or what's the modal shift opportunity or risk here in this particular question.
So is it a governmental run institute, or is it?
Just like most of UK academia, we have research funding from a number of different sources. Our core funding comes from the UK government, and I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but a majority of our funding will come from something called the Research Councils UK, which is the UK government's arm for deciding where and what subjects to spend government research funding on. And then that's supplemented by a number of different sources of funding. And I guess one of the things that we've been trying to do at least within shipping, is diversify away from pure research funding. And sometimes we get involved in consultancy work. And we do that for two reasons. One is obviously it means that we don't just rely on one source of funding. The UK government can build hopefully a more stable and larger team, but also it gives us access to stakeholders that we wouldn't have received if we were just working for the government all the time. It means we form close working relationships with shipping companies, with ship owners associations, or international NGOs, and I think that means that we start to get more of an understanding about how the industry works than we would have got from a conventional academic funding route.
How did you get the shipping bug? How old were you then?
I think pretty young. Maybe it's a bit of a cliche, but sailing and spending holidays on the sea with grandparents and parents, and finding the physics and operation of ships fascinating, and then choosing it as a second degree. Actually, I started on general engineering as a first degree, and was really appreciative of having a really broad base, and then specialising later on ships. But I think it had been there pretty much all the way through my education, a slight sort of obsession.
Yeah, that is how it turns out for most people.
Yeah, that's what I said. It's a cliche, unfortunately.
I find that either you are born into it, or you just stumble on a banana leaf or something, yeah, and then you're there, and then you never leave again.
Indeed.
That's how it works. I understand that you work a lot for the IMO.
We've done a couple of projects for the IMO Secretariat, and we also we try and work so that our research can be used in the arguments and discussions. So we're interested in making sure that research that we're doing can be used by policymakers in evidence-based decision-making. And in order to enable that, we've formed particular connections to the Institute of Marine Engineers, Science and Technologists, which is IMAREST, which has an NGO seat at IMO, and Royal Institute of Naval Architects, the RENA, which also has an NGO seat at IMO. So I guess we've been very lucky to have been able to follow as a delegate of those two NGOs the discussions that have been evolving over the last few years on CO2 and energy efficiency. And then had the excellent fortune to lead the third IMO greenhouse gas study, which was carried out a couple of years ago now, to try and quantify the global CO2 emissions from international shipping, and also think about scenarios for the future emissions. So yes, we've managed to be involved in those discussions, which is a fantastic privilege.
How was that? How do you start a work like that?
You have a misplaced sense of what is feasible within a very short period of time, and you take on something which is far too ambitious, and somehow it happens because we're very lucky at forming this very international group of experts. So fortunately, there have been two IMO greenhouse gas studies previously, so there was at least a sort of a precedent and a guiding methodology. And by involving a lot of the authors of those previous studies, so particularly Professor Corbett at University of Delaware, we had this amazing team of international experts who'd worked with the data, who'd solved similar studies previously, and by combining that experience, we had a shot at trying to do a more ambitious study. We took a very high resolution data set of ship observations from AIS data, the Automatic Identification System data, and used it to observe on an hourly basis what every ship in the world was doing, how fast it was going, whether it was at sea or in port. And then by coupling that to models of ships' engines and how much energy they consume based on their activity, we're able to come up with quite a high resolution estimate of fuel consumption. And at the time, that was a step forwards methodologically. Whether we'll see that ultimately we've got the right numbers from that method is an interesting question, and we've spent a lot of time looking at uncertainty and testing the quality by comparing what we estimate with that method against what fuel ship owners are reporting. And so we were lucky to validate against a lot of ship owners' data sets of their actual fuel consumed. But time will tell when we get more data on the shipping industry, potentially through the IMO's fuel monitoring exercise, which is hopefully starting soon. Yeah, it was an extraordinary project to be involved in, and a massive academic challenge or a sort of research challenge, but hugely rewarding, and a fascinating opportunity for our team to see where these subjects of research and policy execution interact with each other, because clearly you need to present the information in a way that it's understandable to a very broad audience. And we were told repeatedly by several people how we'd gotten into too much complication. We were not making a clear message, especially to people who don't have English as a first language, which just is a great lesson for us. You know, if we want our work to be used and to be relevant, it needs to be very accessible, because these policy discussions are being held by lots of people for whom English isn't a first language, and for whom the deep science of naval architecture or marine engineering is not their home turf. So it was fascinating.
So do you use modern technology to visualize and show or is it still dry figures? Or?
Well, the report is pretty dry. I don't know how many people have actually read it. It's heavy because we wanted to be very expressive about exactly how we'd reached our numbers, and so that anyone could trace it and it was transparent. That was a very important part of the work, to ensure that it had credibility and trust. We're doing lots of work at the moment so that we can visualize the industry, because it is such a hard, for anyone who knows how ships operate, they think they already have the image in their heads. But, you know, potentially for some of the negotiators at IMO who don't come from a ship operating background, and potentially for others who are trying to get their head around the sector, it's very difficult, I think, sometimes. And we've been working with animations using this data source, which are incredible. We had an animation done maybe 4 years ago, which has been the slide that I use in almost every presentation I give. And we actually had a UK government minister who came to visit the department and make a speech about some kick-off project. So he wasn't inculcated into the shipping industry, but he spent about 10 minutes watching this animation and sort of marvelling at the way it was showing the VLCCs coming out of Persian Gulf and the Arabian Gulf and heading to the refineries in Asia, and just showing the spatio-temporal dynamics of the industry, which is a very pretentious way of showing how the ships move around the world and how they start and they stop and how quickly they turn around. So I think there's masses that can be done to improve understanding. And as researchers who sit with the numbers all the time, we find that a very rich source of information too, and have found other stakeholders in shipping who, again, know how the industry works, but who see the animations and can get a meaning and an interpretation from it that maybe they didn't get from their day-to-day sort of data sets that they were looking at.
Yeah, and also, I mean, we tend to work in silos in a way. So the more you understand about what other parts of the industry does,
yeah,
maybe you could change your way of doing things and that will impact them, or you can listen to what they do and you can draw other conclusions than you usually do.
Absolutely, yeah. Some quite defined roles, aren't there, in the way that there's a trader and a broker and a ship owner and potentially, you know, they've all got deep understanding of that, but these animations or some of the ways that we can share some of the data and modelling that we've been doing enables those different stakeholders or perspectives to engage with the industry's messy problems like climate change and CO2 and spot the opportunities. So yeah, I agree. It's difficult for the way the industry is structured.
So how many people were in that group?
The third greenhouse gas study report was produced by a team of, I can't remember, I think there were 9 or 10 organisations and maybe 2 or 3 people on average in the organisation. So actually, yeah, potentially 20 people, I think, might have been closely involved in working. And then it was overseen by a 19-member country steering committee at the IMO. So there were lots of people involved in seeing it come to fruition, having some hand in its success.
And what was the outcome now that you have? It's been a while.
What was the outcome? I'm not yes, how do you answer that without it sounding too underwhelming? I think this is what happens in academia all the time. You put an enormous amount of effort into doing something, and really all you're doing is providing a slightly more scientific derivation of something that everyone already knew and had in their guts, but you've just now shown them with a very laborious calculation. So what happened, one of the things that we were particularly interested in the third greenhouse gas study was trying to observe and quantify the phenomenon of slow steaming, which was such an important part of the market between, 2008, 2009, when the global financial crisis hit, and really still is present in the industry now. And one of the questions we were asked was, what is the consequence of this phenomenon of slow steaming on the sector's emissions? Because the previous greenhouse gas study had been done on the year 2007, so before financial crisis. So we had a line in the sand of what we thought the CO2 from shipping was then. Then the world changed and obviously invited this question. And we quantified that it had reduced had a very significant reduction on CO2 emissions in relative and even in absolute terms. So the efficiency of ships had improved. The CO2 emissions per ton mile had improved, partly because of speed, partly because we were building bigger ships, and partly because some of those ships have now got slightly better technology on, so we're able to do the same amount of transport work, but slightly less emission. So there are a few different factors that it's not entirely easy to untangle, but we could see some very significant impacts of speed. And that's been used as evidence in a lot of the policy discussions since, and it's been part of the way the IMO interacts with the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So the IMO can go to the UNFCCC and say, look, we know what our emissions are, we know what has happened in the last few years, and we also have some estimates from this work about what our future emissions will be. And that's the tricky bit, because those future scenarios are for growing emissions, and obviously that's pretty fundamentally incompatible with the way the UNFCCC process is heading, which is towards decarbonisation and certainly very much reduced CO2 even in a short timescale of a few decades. Mm-hmm. So I think the impact has been positive, but perhaps everyone in the shipping industry was not surprised when they saw that we'd said slow steaming reduces emissions. It's hard to get a lot of mileage out of that sort of headline, which wasn't really what we were trying to do, but that's one side effect.
So how is that going forward now?
The third greenhouse gas study came at a very opportune time for our research group, because we've spent a lot of our effort over the last 4 or 5 years to build models that can estimate future scenarios and pathways for the shipping industry out over the next 30, 40 years. And we've been doing that because we're interested to see whatever we can do as a group to help enable the industry to transition on to its sort of low carbon trajectory, whatever will come next. And we saw a massive deficit of research being done on that subject and a lack of knowledge base. So we all, I think, not all of us, but I think a lot of people have a good understanding of how you can make incremental improvements to ships' energy efficiency. There's lots of things we can do to propellers, to engines, to hull forms, but fundamentally none of that is going to enable decarbonisation. It just improves efficiency. And that lack of knowledge of how you get further, how you actually decarbonise was missing. We put a lot of resource into it, and we realised that we didn't really understand the baseline year very well. So we were building these models that said, let's start in 2010 and forecast out to 2050. And we came up with lots of ways for forecasting, but we worried about how well we understood what was happening in 2010 and what the evidence was from what happened 2007 to 2012, 15, that would be useful for understanding what might happen in the future. And again, slow steaming is an excellent example there. So we know that there's some relationship between freight rates, fuel prices, and ship speeds. We know that we can draw sort of cause and effect links between those things. but it's hard to quantify exactly how significant the effects might be, i.e. how high does the fuel price have to go given a certain freight rate for a certain speed to be incentivized within the global container fleet or the global dry bulk fleet. And there was evidence from the historical period that's useful for us to understand how speed might be an important parameter in the future and how it might play a role in helping to decarbonize the global shipping system or not, because these are questions that I think need more debate and more discussion. So we spent a couple of years really focused on looking historically, and in this intensive period of time when there was high variation in the shipping industry. And that's enabled us to now go back and revise our earlier models and come up with much more authoritative bases for projecting into the future. So the next step is to really go back to that work. And I think the timing is almost perfect. I was very worried when we really kicked off our research activity in 2010, because the market-based measure discussion was already moving at the IMO, that, you know, all of the debate will have been had in the next couple of years, and we'd be sitting there as academics looking rather stupid because we were still talking about the hypothetical market-based measure that had actually already been implemented by the IMO the year before. Well, obviously, we can look historically, and that was clearly wrong. It's taken a lot longer to progress discussions. But I think 2016 is going to be a fascinating year. We've got so much momentum out of Paris globally on the issue of CO2, and exactly how that momentum will affect the shipping industry isn't clear yet, but the opportunity for us to now come to those debates with much more mature data and models, much more confidence and authority, and a better understanding of how the industry works, stakeholders, what the connections between them are, how the policy for it works. We're not as naive as we used to be. We're probably still naive, but we're less naive. And I think that's really exciting, because the next couple of years could see some impressive advance of this really difficult subject.
So do you think it's good or bad that shipping and aviation were left out of the equation in Paris?
Yeah, it's a really tricky one, because we don't really know what. It would be lovely to do the experiment and rerun Paris and include it and then see how different things would be today. Those are the sort of things that academics say, aren't they? Knowing what I now know, which is that the Paris Agreement has had a strong impact on several stakeholders in the shipping industry, I don't think it has mattered that there isn't explicit language in the Paris Agreement on shipping. There were several ways that could have gone. There could have been language that said, we, i.e. UNFCCC, expect IMO to deal with CO2. But that statement is not additional to what we know already from Kyoto Protocol and the debates that IMO is already having. IMO already recognises it has responsibility on CO2. The other scenario would have been that Paris had made some very prescriptive target for shipping within the Paris Agreement text. But no sector has got a prescriptive target, no country has got a prescriptive target. So that would have been very unlikely and very out of step with the rest of that agreement. So I wasn't anticipating that scenario. So given the choice between a weak statement in the Paris Agreement and no statement at all, I think the difference is none. And what was much more important was to show that the world was coming together to solve this problem, which is what Paris has done. Now there's a conversion of that sentiment into action, which is going to be very difficult and is going to test whether that expression in Paris was genuine. But I don't think we could have got more out of Paris from the perspective of shipping's next 12, 18 months than we did, which is excellent.
I've seen a slide from you where you examine counter arguments. And I love it that you have been so explicit with your slide that you are deleted the text that you have written there. And the argument is the greenest form of transport, too important to the global economy, intractable for developing countries. Current technology is the only solution. And you have taken them out. Why?
Yeah. So I can go through them one by one. I mean, because their arguments are very often used. But I think the main point that I'm trying to make with that slide is it's futile to lobby the laws of physics, right? So the climate science is very simple. There's a finite amount of CO2 that we can emit into the atmosphere. And what that means is that there's a certain budget of CO2 emissions that we can emit between now and any point in the future in order to avoid the 1.5 or 2 degree rise. So to say that any one sector should not have any constraint is just illogical, given the laws of physics that we can use to define the carbon budget. And I think my concern with those statements is that they're too often used as an attempt to argue why shipping shouldn't have regulation on CO2 or a cap on its emissions. Clearly, it needs to be carefully thought about how you define its targets, its objectives from a CO2 perspective, but you can't continue to emit CO2, and therefore, at some point, it will have to decarbonise. The question is when. And so if we take the greenest form of transport, yes, shipping is the greenest form of transport. We have studied that on behalf of the IMO Secretariat. And certainly big ships consume very small amounts of fuel to move enormous quantities of mass and cargo, and you can't compete. But the global transport system cannot be delivered just by ships. It needs other modes of transport. So to say that you shouldn't decarbonise ships because it's somehow protected is illogical. It's too important to the global economy. Yes, economic development is closely linked to globalization. Globalization doesn't happen if you don't have shipping. These are very plausible arguments, but they don't explain why you need to rewrite the laws of physics and prevent CO2 from being emitted from the means of moving goods around the world. It just means you have to be careful and sensitive about the way you design policy so that you don't disrupt globalization and you don't have, or you have minimal, least cost impacts on that very important global economic system. It's intractable for developing countries. So this particularly refers to the fact that if we mitigate CO2 emissions from ships, we then potentially increase transport cost. And if we increase transport cost, then countries, particularly developing countries, might have very significant impacts on their economies, either because you increase the cost of goods they are importing from outside, which makes standards of cost of living very high and standards of living low, or because they've got export-led economic growth, so they are no longer able to compete in the global markets. But, again, economists have shown very easily that there are compensation mechanisms, that the impacts of transport cost rises on, it's called price elasticities of demand, are manageable and actually easily counteracted with some sort of compensation fund. So it's an important point. It needs lots of thought, but it's not intractable. And there are ways that policy can and needs to be designed to compensate. And then finally, this one is really difficult because it's so sensitive and it's almost a psychological problem. So the argument as to whether or not current technology is the only solution. Can we envisage a world where a ship that moves 5,000 TEUs around the world and has a 20 megawatt engine could have something other than oil-derived or gas-derived fuels powering it? That's the question. And as an academic sitting in an ivory tower, I have a luxury of being able to say, of course you can. Of course there are solutions. There are laboratory trials, full-scale trials of powertrains that use zero carbon fuels. They exist. Cars run around the road. Demonstrator buses run on hydrogen. It's not inconceivable. We could scale those up and add enough of those fuel cells together, or add enough of the ammonia or synthetic fuel together in a tank to run an engine, whether it's internal combustion or fuel cell, that produces equivalent power outputs to the current ships. So it's easy for me to say. It's much harder to demonstrate that and show that opting for such a solution doesn't cause a fundamental disruption in the global system. But the point was made very eloquently in a meeting I was at last week. If I said we'll be running ships on methanol, or this liquid form of a gas that you need to store at minus a couple of 100 degrees centigrade, and have all the handling risks associated with moving that liquid gas around, and all the safety systems, people would have laughed at me 10 years ago, but it's now a reality. So the concept that we couldn't envisage any alternative fuel is now proved to be a null argument. It doesn't mean we've cracked that problem. I've just striked through each of those, but they're excuses which just don't have substance when you weigh them up against the laws of physics and the challenge of climate change?
I live in Gothenburg, that's in Sweden, so we are in the heart of the Seca area, more or less. And there was a big debate prior to that decision, or when the decision was taken and when it's going to be implemented and so on. But I have never seen so many innovative ideas in one place before. And there are so many things happening, and as you mentioned, methanol is one of the projects within that EU-financed project within the Motorways of the Sea, together with the scrubbers and LNG infrastructure and so on. So I think you're right. I tend to agree. I just thought it was provocative to do it the way you did it with your slide, and I really like it.
Yeah, well, if I never get invited to certain meetings again, I'll know. It's a bit too provocative, but yeah, I think it's a mindset problem. Certain stakeholders in the industry need to switch from thinking in the policy debates, how do we argue for what we can get away with? They need to switch from that perspective to one in terms of what is the problem that we're engaging with? What do we know about the problem? And what is the least painful and least cost way of transitioning through that problem? And it's extraordinary that we still have such a presence of the what can we get away with mindset. And I think that's probably maybe an understandable product of the way that global policy discussions have gone. We can be very cynical about some of the UNFCCC meetings about what they've really achieved, how much decarbonisation has occurred in other sectors, And if that's happening, then it's understandable that certain industries, like shipping, take a what can we get away with perspective. But it's just not sustainable for the industry to continue to do that. So it's great to see that one of the consequences of Paris is people starting to move to a more progressive attitude.
Do you think that's sort of a problem for this generation of decision makers or ship owners? Will it change when there is a new generation coming up?
As a young researcher, I don't know if I've got enough experience to make a judgment on generational change. And I don't want to sound too pessimistic either, but I'm not entirely convinced. I think it's a product of the global governance system. It's a product of how policy processes are viewed by people who aren't central in them. The cynicism that you can get from being a couple of steps removed and seeing IMO or EU or whatever as this horrible rule-making body that just makes your life more difficult and expensive, which it has. I'm not suggesting everything it does is perfect. It's made lots of mistakes as a body, or things could have been done better as a body. And I think that misinterpretation of process, of intention, is easy regardless of the generation that comes through. So there's got to be a better way of, I don't think we just solve it with time, we solve it with a better dialogue and understanding of that interaction between an industry and the system that governs it and the rationality of the decisions made by that governing system. That's probably far too theoretical and pretentious.
No, I understand. But then again, when you see the ship owners that has actually done all what they were supposed to do to live up to these new rules and regulations, they have now formed a special team within the Trident group. And now they are telling policymakers or politicians, you need to live up to this. We have done what you asked us. Why don't you chase the other ones who are not doing what you told them to do?
Yeah, which is brilliant. I think the Trident is an excellent initiative, and it shows how multidimensional the problem is. You can't just go into a governing body like the IMO, make a rule and expect that to be the end of the story. It needs to be followed through with credible enforcement and compliance, and the sort of action and initiative that Trident has taken is exactly what is good and progressive about the shipping industry. And I think I don't want to heap praise on just a small number of actors, because there are loads of people who've done lots of clever things to engage with the policy processes. I just mean I still encounter regularly disenchantment, understandably, because there are some some things which are not perfect in the way that regulations are formed. And just this, I mean, I hope none of what I'm saying comes across as glib to the ship owner and sort of, you haven't done enough. That's certainly not our perspective. It's just, it's incredibly painful at the moment in the market, and saying on top of ballast water, SOx, NOx, black carbon, PM, or only long list of things which mean to a ship owner capex and more capital that I don't have. Now we've got to deal with CO2 on top of that is understandably a very difficult message. And the sensitivity of the argument means that it's much preferable to say, just leave us alone for a few years whilst we catch our breath after ballast water and SOx and NOx, and then we'll start thinking about that. But potentially that isn't going to cause less pain in the long run. And I'm sure there's more we can do to try and sort of reassure, and more we can do, I don't mean us UCL, I mean collectively across the industry, to dispel some myths and to engage more scientifically with the policy debates, to feed good data and evidence and information to the negotiators who often don't have that at their fingertips, to share, become more transparent, and all of that will help.
I think you're right. But then there is also other things happening on shore that might have an impact on shipping industry. I'm thinking about the digitalization, automation, all of that, which we haven't really seen come through into the shipping industry as a whole yet. You see the sea traffic management. That is also something that might have an impact on. I mean, it's not just only the technology that we know in that perspective. I think that there are other disciplines that will have effect on the shipping industry. What is your view on that?
Yes, absolutely. And we are definitely guilty of taking a rather narrow-minded sort of CO2 perspective, which is not our intention. Think how all of those puzzles of data, logistics systems, automation interact with the evolution of the industry will be fascinating and exciting. And I don't think I probably could have gone to a different conference on big data or autonomous ships for every month of last year. And I suspect it'll be the same in 2016 and 17. So I think shipping industry does show an enormous appetite for entertaining these concepts, discussing them at conferences. It would be great to see more evidence of it happening in the companies as well. And actually we've been very privileged to work with a number of ship owners who have taken very progressive steps on data, on integrating data measured at sea with systems they have in shore, and setting them up according to KPIs not just for performance purposes, but business purposes as well. And I think there's going to be some fascinating evolutions as the siloed industry that we referred to earlier shares information across the institution more effectively and is able to therefore make much more optimized techno-commercial decisions, if you like. So instead of just having a superintendent who's making sure all the machinery is working really well and is complying with regulation, the trader is seeing whether ship A is more efficient than ship B and whether it's got certain attributes that mean it'll be better en route between these two countries or not. So the potential to improve the way that the organisation makes decisions all the way across the organisation is enormous. And then autonomous ships and what that opens up is another fantastic field. And they all interplay because logistic efficiency, technology for low carbon and autonomy is interconnected in lots of different ways. We can only do so much with 15 people. But we work closely with others who are looking at all of those things.
Yeah, but you also mentioned the leadership within the shipping industry.
Yeah.
Lack of leadership within the shipping industry.
I
It's
think
a bullet point.
I know it is. I did say it. You're right. It's a question that we've sort of asked ourselves, where does the vision and the leadership for a transition come from? And by that, I'm back on the hobby horse of CO2 emissions again. And it's difficult because the power brokers at places like the IMO are obviously port states, flag states, the industry NGOs themselves. And And it's hard to see sometimes in the debates on greenhouse gases where the voice in the room is that is saying, actually, here is our vision for the future, and we're leading now. And there are some organisations that have shown extraordinary vision, like Sustainable Shipping Initiative, who have engaged their 17, 18 members to try and think through the next 20, 30 years, set themselves a set of roadmaps and targets, and they're now communicating that to the wider industry, and well, it'd be interesting to see how that evolves in the next couple of years. But isn't that fascinating that, in this massive global industry, it's an NGO based just actually down the road from us here in London that's been the visionary, and all the other organisations that have got centuries of heritage haven't really figured out that there's going to be this change in the next few decades, and they're not prepared for it. And worse than that, they're not helping their members prepare for it by giving them some advice on how to get there. They're simply often just playing this "what can we get away with" lobby rule. And so I think, I'm not saying no one's got vision. I'm just saying it's interesting how scarce a commodity it might be on this topic at the moment. And I'm sure that the reason for that is because it's such a messy, difficult problem to decarbonise shipping that it's much easier to say, let's push this another 5 years down the road and keep a conservative position rather than engage with it. But I think that's the tipping point that I'm perennially hoping that we're on, because if we don't, it'll just make it harder in a few years' time.
But that's the usual pattern for the shipping industry, to wait until it's not 5 to 12, but 5 past 12 to do things.
And again, I don't want to sound glib, because if I was running a shipping company, that's probably my strategy as well. I mean, you're probably quite short-staffed, and you don't have a team of people who can sit and have the luxury of mulling over the strategy like we have here. So, I mean, it's not criticism, it's just an observation that there's a lack of leadership at the moment. And
can I be a bit provocative then?
Yeah, well, it's about time.
Is it a gender question?
Everything's a gender question.
There are not a lot of women within the shipping industry
No, it's true, and it's difficult, isn't it? Difficult to change that, and I know that you're involved, and the stuff that Wista's doing is fantastic, and it's really measurable. It's noticeable. It seems to me that it's having impact. We've had times when our research group has been actually majority female, and those times were almost certainly, superior times in our history. We're not majority female at the moment. Yes, I'm sure having a more balanced gender mix would make debates, leadership, vision more effective.
I was amazed that there were, I think, 8 candidates for the Secretary General position, and there was not one woman.
Yes, positive discrimination now at IMO. Is that the the position? Yeah, and there are some amazing women in the industry, so it is interesting why it's not happened more. It's not that there aren't brilliant case studies, which sometimes is a problem in an industry, that no one can look at senior women. But, who are we to point a finger? Academia is terrible, and senior management in academia is massively gender biased for lots of reasons, some of them possibly patriarchal. And so I don't think I'm on a very, the expression people in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. So certainly an academic shouldn't accuse another sector of being gender biased.
No, but also if you look upon the UN, there are not a lot of women within the UN either.
Yeah.
Visible, at least. They might be doing a lot of good job, but you can't see them. So how do you see the future now for shipping in general?
That's for someone who spends all their time modelling scenarios of the future, I should be able to answer this question, but I think it's quite positive, because there is still time. If I can just resort to a bit of climate jargon for a second, a 2-degree pathway is sort of decarbonisation around 2080, 2070, depending on your assumptions, but that's the approximate timescale, which means halving CO2 emissions by 2050, which is in absolute terms, which is a pretty phenomenal objective. Because in average carbon intensity terms, that means reducing by 80 to 90% the CO2 emitted by ton mile of the current fleet. Now, there are lots of things that will be part of whether you get there. But I think with a 35-year time frame, I don't see why that isn't achievable. And I don't see with the industry's track record for innovation, for embracing some really tricky challenges historically, safety challenges, for example, that it isn't feasible to crack the CO2 nut and therefore grow the fleet at the same time as demands for trade, and for us to continue to have a really exciting shipping industry that's servicing world trade and helping everyone live better, safer, healthier lives. So it's potentially very, very rosy. And I think that we spend so much time on CO2 looking at the downsides, but there are actually phenomenal upsides. So there are upsides for any equipment manufacturer, because the next few decades are going to be a fascinating and exciting time for anyone involved in R&D, to engine production to fuel production. If I was an engineer over the last 20 years, making a 1% improvement in the two-stroke combustion efficiency, I would probably find that satisfying, but it's not as exciting as being involved in a revolution. So there's a great time for technology. There's a great time for startups and for those parts of the industry to become really exciting. If you're a ship owner, yes, there's a capital cost headache probably at some point, but there's no reason why you should be in a relatively worse position than your peers, as long as we design a policy system which is at this level playing field, the much overused phrase that hopefully means that we're all in it together and we're all experiencing the challenges at the same time. So yes, there are problems, but it should be at least even. And actually what we find in a lot of our modelling is that because you get this combination of ships slowing down a small amount, maybe switching to an alternative fuel, maybe going for a few renewables and energy efficiency devices, that means you need many more ships. So there's no shortage of growth in fleet, and therefore there's no shortage in growth potential for individual companies if they're sort of navigating this period skillfully. And clearly the way not to do it is to buy a load of ships with yesterday's technology and have them on a deal that means they're on your books for another 15 years, because that's could mean that you're being left with some stranded assets that you can't either operate or you then can't resell in some way. So there are some strategically challenging headaches, but I don't see why fundamentally that's not an opportunity for ship owners. I suspect for operators it's going to be a tricky time, and for shippers, the people coming to the industry for services, because in a rapidly changing technology landscape, how do you know what technology you should be using? There's been a relatively straightforward choice, perhaps. Do I move my iron ore in a Panamax or a Cape? And if I do move it in a Panamax or a Cape, my choices within those subsets are relatively straightforward. Now it's going to become more difficult. Maybe some things will need to be more vertically integrated because of the way that bunkers and regional availability of certain types of bunkers might differ. So maybe they're the group that we should feel most sorry for, but even there's probably opportunity. And the thing that scares people about change is because they might lose their position, but really it's just opportunity as well. So it's just like having a glass that's half full or half empty, and you can embrace it and be forefront and make money, or you can try and pretend it doesn't exist and maybe lose money.
But the cost for this technical leap, who's going to carry that? Because the ship owner has a problem getting capital, because you can't take on more cargo just because it's a green ship with the new technology.
Yeah. So I think ultimately we will need to take it as consumers. Costs will be passed downstream. Lots of people argue that doesn't happen, or it's very difficult, and certainly in short run it is. So, if you have to fit ballast water technology, that doesn't mean that suddenly the rates go up in the market. So that's what I mean by the short run. Just over a period of like 12 months or 2 years, then you wouldn't necessarily see that play out. But ultimately, if we had to pay a little bit more for the pair of trainers that we've bought from a shop that have been bought here on a low carbon ship, I think the supply chains can handle it. And the evidence that we've looked at, and we're spending a lot of time trying to think about this at the moment, are that there shouldn't be demand impacts. We can cope with a bit of cost, a bit of increased cost on the transport side, at least in the developed world. And then we then have to think about the developing world and how we help them enable to cope with increased transport costs. And that will need to feed back into freight rates that reflect the cost of the technology. But shipping market, this is why it doesn't work in the short run, because shipping markets don't necessarily model cost. They model how the fleet evolves in supply and demand terms. But it's there's going to be some turbulence, and there will be some periods of very high freight rate, probably, just as we've seen historically, as fleets have these technical transitions that mean that sometimes we're left with ships that maybe aren't operable under certain regulations, e.g., for example, a carbon price might come in, and that carbon price might make it very difficult for older ships with poorer technology that people can't retrofit to compete in the same market. And that will create a supply tightening, which will increase freight rates. So there will be periods, just as there always have been, when ship owners have made lots of money, and there will be periods when they need to make cost cuts to absorb the lower rates, and there'll be a long run trend, and that long run trend will have to reflect the technology costs associated with what we're operating. That's a very sort of simplified economist type perspective, and I'm not an economist, so I guess I should caveat everything with that. But in any economic system, there's no excuse that we can't pass the costs in some direction and somehow reflect them in prices. That will have to occur. It'll just take some time.
Shipping is looked upon as the invisible industry sometimes. What do you think we could do to become more visible?
This is really interesting because we're puzzling at the moment about whether you really need to bring public discourse into the sector's future, or whether it can continue to exist as it does with a group of stakeholders who understand it well and trying to make informed decisions. And I think as a group, we're heading in the direction that it benefits from having more public scrutiny rather than disbenefits, as long as that's informed public scrutiny. And we're doing bits and pieces at the moment to try and write articles in the mass media, not just the shipping media, that explain some of the challenges the industry might face. And also use the data that we're working with to produce graphics that will engage and attract members of the public or anyone,
or ministers,
or even ministers in the subject, because there's innate beauty in some of those graphics and in people sort of marveling at this amazing service that is just ignored and invisible to the person on the street. So I think, so maybe we have some responsibility as our research group to share what we're doing in the public discourse more, and to use the tools that we've got to make it an attractive subject and not a technical subject, attractive aesthetically almost. And then I think there's a question of maybe the end users and the supply chain. They need to start to raise the profile of shipping as part of their puzzle. So if you take some of the trucks that we see on our roads, Marks and Spencer or Argos will make a big fuss about that truck having an aerodynamic device that's improving its fuel efficiency and brand it, and members of the public have become aware of that. It's such a pity they don't do the same with their efforts to decarbonise their maritime supply chains. And maybe that's indicative that actually end users aren't, like the supermarkets or the traders, aren't thinking very hard about the maritime component of their CO2 emissions. They've done the trucks because they can see those out the office window, but they haven't really engaged with the challenge of the ship. But seeing as they're the people who ultimately have to sell the cost increases to the consumer, it's in their interest to do so by saying, and by the way, it's this amazing shipping industry that brought you this, and one of the reasons you're paying 5p more for this pair of trainers is because it's been brought here on this amazing ship with all this extraordinary technology. Isn't that fantastic? And lots of people could, say a bit more about the industry, and I'm sure we'll hear that more. But I wonder if there's something in that supply chain, the retailers, if you like, that could help the public understand the sector.
Yeah, and also, just having a strategy for your communication and how you raise the profile. Like, for instance, sustainable shipping. I think they're doing a great job. Yeah. Because that sort of gets different sides of shipping industry, the supply chain, logistics, and climate, and a lot of different angles into the same communication to people.
Yeah.
And sooner or later that will reach people outside.
There are two things that the Sustainable Shipping Initiative did that were so remarkable. One is obviously start this vision, and the other is bring together that group of stakeholders. And I was so excited when it formed, and this sort of puzzle that we'd been grappling with ourselves. Shipping is not just about ship owners, and it's so often presented in that way, and so many of the fora are ship owner dominated, which is not a bad thing, but this SSI, and it's bringing together in a small room, in a small team of every one of the major parts of the puzzle, was fantastic. And it gives you the communication opportunities that we can't generate when we're just looking silos again.
Yeah, and also, we need to recruit young people like you into our industry. The ones who hasn't got the bug yet. They need to know what a cool industry we're working in.
Yeah, it's interesting. We've got very few people in our research group who came from the shipping industry or some sort of connection to shipping. They just saw it as an academic subject, and maybe I pressured them into applying for a job or something. But once they've got into the research group and seen what a fascinating industry it is, none of them have left. So they've all kept some sort of, even those that have gone on to other careers, they've all kept some connection to the industry. And that just tells me that it's innately fascinating. There's no shortage of stimulating employment opportunity. There's simply an awareness issue. So, more of that would be good, because there's no way that you can do the research we do without the brightest brains choosing to investigate the subject, and the more of them, the better.
Did you have a role model?
Yes, several. Lots of different. I've had some excellent bosses, and in a variety of different jobs, who are probably where I would take my role models from. Bosses who are very good at building teams and enabling teams to work effectively. Bosses that are very astute at negotiating situations and working within complicated organisations, which is not something that I'm not using that to explain how I manipulate the university. I mean, it just shows how those role models showed me how important it was to be sensitive to political situations between any two groups, or, when I deal with a large company that I know nothing about, it hopefully gives me some sensitivity in those situations and how to operate. And those have been very inspirational, and my group will probably laugh at both of those examples, because they'll think that I'm both insensitive and rubbish at sort of coordinating a team, but I've tried to learn.
Who would you be interested in listening to in a podcast? Who do you think I should interview the next time?
So I've not listened to all of your podcasts, but I listened to a couple of them, and I looked through your list, and I think you said it in one of your interviews, actually, that you keep interviewing people who you agree with. I think you need to interview some people who aren't necessarily on the same wavelength, because I don't think until we understand, and we try and do this all the time, we test ourselves all the time on, is there something fundamental that we're missing here? Why is this stakeholder continuing to say this argument? Have we misunderstood them? Or what's the failure? And so I think more work needs to be done to understand why people are resisting something. Which is rather, I'm just putting it in that in specific phrasing because you've got such a broad range of topics that you're studying in this podcast. But, sometimes it's not just the leaders you want to interview, but the people who are resisting and understand why. So I'd be very interested to listen more and learn more on that.
Me too. It might be shorter interviews.
That doesn't matter. You could have you could do a bit of both, and sometimes there are people in the middle as well. What I mean is, maybe this is answering the previous question about some of my role models, but I had a boss who I'd got to the end of a 2-year job, and I was really pleased with myself and thinking I'd done a great job, and went to the exit interview with this senior manager, and he started giving me all these criticisms, and I sort of went, well, I thought I did really well. I did all of this stuff. And he was like, yeah, but you don't learn through praise, you learn through criticism. So you learn through understanding what you're not doing right at the moment. So if this is about understanding and communication, it's also got to be about understanding why this is changing some portion, but maybe not changing another portion of the sector of the industry.
I'm going to go and find them. Thank you very much, Tristan. Thank you for taking the time to speak to me.
Not at all. Thank you so much, and thank you for the initiative of the podcast as well. Extraordinary shows how unoriginal we are, but we internally have been saying, why doesn't this exist? And then came across your podcast. So before we managed to get something equivalent ourselves, you beat us to it, but I'm so glad you're doing it, and everything I've heard is brilliant and very insightful, so thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, my interest in digitalization is probably not a secret to anyone. I often hear that I am ahead of our industry when I speak about transparency and sharing knowledge and so on. But now I can see that I have found some like-minded people. I think that is why I am looking so hard for people who share my view of what the shipping industry needs. Now I have to take on the advice that Tristan gave me. He wants me to interview someone who I disagree with or who doesn't see the same things that I do for the industry to come. That I think I need some help with. It's easier to find the people who I admire and who I think has actually seen the light in the same way that I have, so to say. But I will take that advice on board and try and find people who I disagree with. You're most welcome to come up with ideas and suggestions for people to talk to. Maybe I need to do a panel. I'm not sure yet. I've been doing this for 8 months now. So many things have happened since I started. I speak to a lot of people who actually don't have any connections within the shipping industry. They are just interested in listening to the podcast and sharing ideas with me who are on the inside, so to say. I've also realized that everyone has got a podcast nowadays. I read in the newspapers every day or hear on the television, listen to the podcast, even if it's sports or any of the other transportation modes or just famous people talking to each other. I'm so pleased that I finally got around to start this podcast. I'm proud of it, and I think it's so interesting. Thank you all for helping me to fulfill my dreams. I hope you will continue to do that, both by downloading and listening and commenting, but also as sponsors. For me to continue with this, I need to get some more sponsors on board. So if you are the one who is actually deciding on the marketing budget, please let me know and we'll figure something out. I hope you enjoyed this 31st episode of the Shipping Podcast. I got some more interviews in pipeline for you. Until then, over and out. Thank you for listening to the Shipping Podcast. Don't forget to tell everyone that you meet that there is a shipping podcast where the maritime professionals are talking about their everyday job.